This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Cutting people off from accurate news and information is a propagandist tool, and it's happening right now in places like Russia as the war in Ukraine continues. Media have reported on Russia's shutdown of local news outlets that are not government-run. Russians are threatened with jail time if they share news about the invasion. Even the words they use have been censored, and that censorship extends all the way to tech giants like Google and Meta, to international media outlets with staff still in Russia. Today, Where We Live, we talk about censorship of the free press and social media. Coming up, we hear from Access Now, a global organization committed to the digital rights of internet users. What questions do you have? You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Before we talk about what's happening right now in Russia, we wanted to get context on censorship back in the former Soviet Union. Joining us now on Zoom is Ellen Lippman. She's a novelist and associate English professor at UConn, and she grew up in the former Soviet Union. Ellen, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
As someone with roots in Russia, you've been also, of course, following what's happening now in Russia since the war began in Ukraine, and we'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. But I wanted you first to share what you remember about living in the former Soviet Union. I understand you left when you were 19 with your family.
That's right. So I would say, half of my time, probably more than half of my time was spent there growing up until my teen years. This was the Soviet Union, as everyone thinks about it, where all the news that we got, everything we got was government produced, government approved, censored. And in a sense, that's the only information we had. Some people did find ways to find out more. Even then, it wasn't legal, but like my father and many other people I know whose parents had shortwave radios, and they would every morning tune in to listen to BBC, to listen to Voice of America. Again, the government tried to sort of disrupt those signals, or did there were a lot of interference in the sound quality. But this is something that people did if they wanted, those who wanted to find out a little bit more, because a lot of people did suspect that we were getting, not quite the full picture. But
so
again,
how many? You mentioned that your dad was using a shortwave radio and others to listen to broadcasts. So tell us more about what you remember. And as you were getting older, when things started to change a little bit in the Soviet Union, where maybe there was more access to information that had been censored in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a kid, I just remember waking up to those sort of the signals that started those shows, the little tunes, the little jingles that started each show. That my parents, when I was little, my parents wouldn't talk to me about it. But then around 1985, things started to change with perestroika. And I think one of the first stages of perestroika was glasnost, which is when all this information started to become available. Publications started to come out about what really happened in Russia's past, Stalin's repressions, and going back to that, and even in further beginning of the revolution in Russia, 1917. So this was really fascinating. It's like we were watching as history was being rewritten, and it wasn't just us, sort of teens. It was our teachers, our parents, who were learning things for the first time. Books that were previously banned started appearing and started being published, and often in the sort of long, big magazine, thick magazine format, so like serialized, and people would just, you can borrow the copy for a night and read that novel that was banned before, and then pass it to the next person in the queue. So in a way, it was really exciting getting that news. New programs started appearing on TV, more Western programs or at least Western music, but a lot of Russian-made news programs that now could present alternative views.
You said it was an exciting time. This, of course, was before the internet. And so was it hard for Russians to distinguish, what was true, what was controlled by the government? Or as things started to loosen up a little, I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how they distinguish the information.
It was hard. There were no ways to, verify who people were, who were producing the news, what they were doing. In a way, it took years then to kind of until internet came about, and you could learn a little bit more about people who were behind it. You could start learning things that you still didn't know. I remember there is still, even with the news, there was so little that we had access to in terms of what the government was doing, deciding what was actually happening. I remember years later, already in the U.S., reading about those years, like say 85 to early 90s, from the book by David Remnick, and who was reporting there at the time, and it was eye-opening because there was just no way Russian people would have that access to that kind of information at the time.
You're hearing Ellen Littman here on Where We Live. She's a novelist and a professor of English at UConn, and she grew up in the former Soviet Union. As we talk about the context of censorship back then and what Russians are experiencing today, if you have a question or a comment, you can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so if we fast forward to today and how you have stayed abreast of what's going on in Russia, as we know, with laws being passed, with censorship being very strong under Vladimir Putin, with citizens being threatened with jail time, with how they share information or talk about even the war in Ukraine, even the word war being censored, yep. Ellen. So tell us about, how you have kept abreast of this and how you've been sharing about this, what you've been able to read.
Right. Well, I have discovered Telegram, the app Telegram. So basically, when the war started, I ended up installing it to make sure I'm still connected to the family and friends I still have in Moscow, in Russia, because from the start there were talks about the media, the internet is going to be limited, the access to social media will be limited. It took them a while, but it is happening. It has happened. So I never had a Telegram installed, but once I did, I realized that you can follow channels, and I realized that a lot of people, journalists, political scientists, economists that I was already following on Facebook, they were leaving Facebook for Telegram. And so I started sort of following them there, and from there sort of following more people that they whose posts they shared and recommended. And so I realized I'm sort of started living in that sort of Telegram kind of a bubble in a way. Some of the media that's been shut down in Russia, some of the opposition alternative media that's been shut down, they all have channels. They also have been creating channels and podcasts on YouTube. So radio station Echo of Moscow, for example, that's been sort of go-to sort of radio station for anyone sort of supporting opposition and just wanted more alternative kind of coverage of events. It's been around for 30 years, so that was shut down. So what they did is they took another name, they started a channel on YouTube, and they started broadcasting some of not all, but some of their programs. So they're all very active in that sort of kind of underground world in the sense.
You mentioned Telegram. Reuters reporting that Telegram, this app, has been popular in Russia for a long time, more popular than WhatsApp, and it has become the country's most used messaging tool in recent weeks due to the government restrictions on other digital services. And so give us an idea of what is being shared. We in reading, Western reports that there is still strong support for Putin within Russia, but for the people that have been downloading and trying to circumvent the censorship, what are they sharing about this moment and what's happening to their country as well as what's happening in Ukraine?
Right. I mean, first of all, people who download it, they can follow news from the sources that are otherwise they can't access anymore, whether it's Western publications or Russian publications. So they can access the actual news, whether it's Ukrainian news, news sources from Belarus, whether it's BBC, etc., etc. So everyone is kind of there, but also there are people share sort of stories that they have encountered themselves. There's been a lot about stories of sort of propaganda that is being directed at schools. People will share photos of photo ops that the schools would have to do, like getting the little kids to stand in the formation of the letter Z, which became kind of a Putin symbol for this war. Obviously all those things that are sort of done. They would share materials that being sent to schools, what teachers are supposed to say to the kids, cases of discrimination, cases of people being fired or arrested, all, and then there are opinions of the experts, different takes on what might happen, from the point of view of the economy, from the point of view of, politically, sort of foreign policy. There is a lot. The question is how much people are actually following it, or who is following it and who is not.
Right. Is there a sense of fear for those that are still in Russia because of the way the Kremlin and Putin operate, people being jailed and protests being curtailed? And I'm wondering if you can talk about that for us.
I mean, I think there is definitely fear associated with if you are choosing to speak up, the increase in surveillance, things like that. That's all possible. I mean, I have one of my friends, her son, who's in his 20s, participated in one protest and immediately started getting visits from the police. The police just comes to your home and to have at first a talk with you or to warn you, things like that. So it's all very scary and very threatening, because Russia, everyone remembers the history. Everyone at this point knows what happened in the 30s and to some degree in the 50s. Everyone remembers the culture where neighbors reported neighbors. And so it is scary.
This must be hard for you to be so connected to Russia because of your family's roots. You said you still have friends there. As you were writing for these articles, I guess been published on Medium and also shared on Facebook. Tell me about some of the things that you focused on, and has it been difficult to try to disconnect? Is this something that you feel so passionate about that you are, on this, 24/7?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really heartbreaking. First of all, the horror of what is happening in Ukraine. You read about it, you see it in the photos, you coming from a country that was so anti-war. That was our whole identity during the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was so lost so much and was so traumatized by the World War II. It was just a huge part of our culture, talking about the war. It can never happen again. The remembrance of the World War II, films, songs, everything, about it. And to see these images of that are basically reminiscent of what we been shown, what fascists did during the World War II to, Russian or Ukrainian, Soviet cities, and now to see Russia doing it to Ukrainian cities, it's just so illogical. And I think a lot of people actually in Russia, older people, have a difficult time reconciling it kind of internally. No, they in denial. That it's like, no, it cannot be happening. This cannot be true. So on that level, it's really hard. But also, I kind of personally, sort of, there's this heartbreak of going from that sort of hope of democracy that I saw as, I was coming of age, going through high school and college, beginning of college. And even though the times were difficult, but there was that freedom and there was that hope. And to see the country, what it's become of it now, and even it's been on the way to this kind of backwards for a while now, but the war is just threw the whole country back into the Soviet life.
So you and your family left after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ellen?
Yeah, shortly after the fall of we left in the fall of '92. And, at the time it took me a while. It was my parents' decision. They were doing it for me and my sister. And it was hard to come to terms with it because everyone I knew, all my friends were there. And it was hard. In retrospect, of course, I'm incredibly grateful that we left. And a lot of people are leaving now Russia for different reasons, obviously. So, yeah.
What has been the feedback that you've received with your Telegram chronicles, Ellen?
I think people are interested. People feel like they're getting, information that they wouldn't otherwise. That is sort of more coming from like, well, what is happening in Russia? How are Russian people? Because I'm sort of, for the most part, I'm talking about the things that Russian experts are saying, Russian economists or Russian politicians or political scientists, pundits, what they're saying. So it's kind of a different perspective and people are interested and appreciate it. And those of my Russian friends who are, following it, they have VPN, they're able to see my posts, sort of, they like, well, yeah, that's, they're happy that I'm voicing things that otherwise wouldn't make it. I started by just kind of doing like the chronicles of each day because I was so overwhelmed by everything that was constantly happening. And now I'm trying to kind of answer sort of more kind of questions that are for myself, right? Why are people supporting this? Why there's such a high percentage of Russian people supporting Putin and his war? Or is it he calls it special operation?
In one of the articles that you wrote, when you talk about, why are people supporting Putin and this war, when we think about the crackdown on the independent free press, but also still the existence of government-controlled news channels like Channel One, which I believe you wrote about. Can you tell us about that?
I think what I'm learning, and it's like every day I'm so immersed in this and listening to these programs and listening and reading. What I've been underestimating, I think, is the presence. I've been saying like, well, people can with the VPN can access the same channels, they just don't want to. But what I don't have is this presence of Channel One, essentially, or of that mainstream government propaganda. And I've been hearing sort of just how powerful it is, how sort of well executed it is. I mean, I was listening to this one political scientist yesterday who said, I accidentally switched on that channel and I was just blown away. It's just, you feel like you're going crazy. So there is that. I'm also, I think that, it's that in a time of war, there is that whole rallying around the leader, rallying around the flag that's happening. I also, another reason that, for the support that I'm hearing about is that just even psychologically adjusting to, you hear about that horrors that's happening in your name, that's being committed in your name, and how do you live with it? So you start looking for justifications just because it's so hard to constantly live with that reality in your face. So people start rationalizing psychologically to themselves why this is or what it making it possible for themselves to live with it somehow. It's also been said that the war still, for most Russian people, feels like it's happening elsewhere, in Moscow, say. For people there, for them it's still distant, and economically it hasn't really affected people seriously just yet. So people feel like, oh, okay, we were afraid that it will be horrible, and everything will change instantly. But yes, things seem okay. We're adjusting. We're okay. So I think that's another reason. And finally, that isolation. Yes, people have access to VPN, other sources through VPN, but they are isolated from the public opinion in the West and in the America, Europe. They are not seeing that the outcry, the shock that the Western community is experiencing watching these events. So not having that in their face also makes it sort of less urgent in some ways, maybe, for people. So those are some of the things that I've been able to kind of understand, because it has been a huge, it's shocking to see the numbers of how high the support is, either for the war or for Putin himself. The ratings are going up for him. So
that's interesting context that you provide, that for Russians there now, they're not feeling the impacts of these sanctions and other measures that we're hearing from Western leaders that are being handed down severely. And so that's why public opinion may not have changed to such a degree as we're seeing from outside Russia.
Yeah.
Ellen?
It's from what I hear, from what sort of various political scientists predict, it will probably take another 2 to 3 months before it will really hit people. I mean, there are certain shortages of this or that are starting, but a lot of the things that have become less available, they weren't available to those with money, but not to those who had less money, who were living more modestly. So, for those people, things haven't changed at all. But it's just, Putin is on borrowed time at this point economically. And so he just has another 2-3 months while he's, he can live in this country, he can rule this country where people don't feel the repercussions economically yet.
You've been hearing Ellen Lippman. Again, she's a novelist, an associate professor of English at UConn, and she's been writing about the information that's being given out in Russia, as well as how Russian citizens are working around censorship to share and to learn about what's going on, especially with the war in Ukraine. Those articles that she's written called the Telegram Chronicles, and we'll share a link with our listeners on our Twitter at Where We Live. Ellen and her family, they were in the Soviet Union until about the mid-1990s or so. Ellen, thank you for sharing your perspective. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up, we're going to talk more about the censorship happening in Russia and how Russians are circumventing these measures. Ellen mentioned a few times VPNs, or virtual private networks, ways to use messaging apps that are encrypted as the shutdown on local press and social media continues by the Kremlin. We're going to hear from 2 organizations, including Access Now, a global organization committed to the digital rights of internet users, and Ranking Digital Rights, an organization that evaluates internet, mobile, and telecommunications based on human rights standards. Now, what questions do you have? You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Since the war in Ukraine began, Russia has shut down free press and social media apps like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Reuters reports that Instagram has said its ban will affect 80 million users in Russia. So we wanted to know, how is it possible for Russians to share and receive accurate information about what's happening? Before we get to that, we wanted some more context on the history of censorship in Russia. Joining us now on Zoom, Nathalie Maréchal, Senior Policy Manager at Ranking Digital Rights. This is an organization that works to evaluate internet, mobile, and telecommunications based on human rights standards. Nathalie, welcome to our show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And listeners can join as well with a question at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Ellen gave us some interesting perspective, what it was like growing up in the former Soviet Union. But when we think about media control and what's happening currently, can you give us more context as we think about in the relationship of Vladimir Putin's rise to power?
Absolutely. That's a really, really important question. Something that I think is really hard for American and Western audiences more broadly to really get in our guts is that in Russia and in the other countries of the former Soviet Union, there isn't the same tradition of the free press or the free media as a central part of the system of governance for society as a whole that we have here, right? Like we have a tradition going back to in the U.S., going back to the U.S. Revolution and even before that. The press is a fourth estate, and that it has a really important role to play in bringing truth to light and in holding the other branches of government accountable and informing the public and so on, which isn't to say that free expression and free press has always been respected in the U.S., but there is this deeply held cultural value there. That's not the case in Russia. Going back to the days of the Tsars, well before the Soviet Union, the understanding was that information was first and foremost a tool for power, and that it was something that needed to be controlled and that needed to be feared. And of course, under the Soviet Union, that the leadership really doubled down on that, right? And Ellen spoke to that very, very eloquently just now, and that's something that. Despite the brief opening in the 90s and very early 2000s, that that's known as glasnost, this idea that information is dangerous and needs to be controlled is something that is a deeply, deeply held belief, but for Vladimir Putin and other elites in his regime.
Mm. Also with us on Zoom is Natalia Krapiva. She's tech legal counsel for Access Now. This is an organization that defends digital rights of internet users around the world. Natalia, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to hear from you through Access Now as a perspective when we think about the government control of free press and social media happening right now in Russia. Who are the people that are still working to provide accurate information, and what's happening to them on the ground in Russia?
Sure. So there's a lot of, there's a number of independent media that still continue working in Russia despite all the censorship. The censorship happened years before the current invasion of Ukraine happened, and it was been gradually increasing. And with the start of the invasion, there was more of a sort of across the board blocking of a lot of independent media organizations online, and also restricting of what they can say and how they can say it. But there's still a number of media such as Doxa, Media Zona, Meduza, who are continuing resisting and still covering the invasion in Ukraine and talking about the protests and everything that's happening. But their websites have been blocked. Then social media, where they also have presence, such as Instagram, Facebook, is being blocked. But they're still continuing. Telegram is still working. And then, of course, as was mentioned earlier, VPN and Tor and other sort of circumvention tools that people, especially younger people, are using to still connect to these platforms to continue receiving the news about what's going on.
You mentioned the young people. You referenced Doxa. I believe this is independent student media. You tweeted the other day that there are young people that are affiliated with Doxa that are now facing up to 3 years in jail for talking about what's happening. Can you give us a little context?
Yes, and this is why it's so the charges stem from earlier events. They go back to the protests associated with Alexei Navalny, who is a anti-corruption activist and opposition leader, after he was poisoned and imprisoned by the government. There were protests associated with that. People were calling on releasing him, but there was also a lot of pressure on young people, on university students, not to go to protests. There was a lot of fear of being basically kicked out of a university. Their careers would be impacted, and so Doxa, as being independent student-led, student media, they recorded a video basically in support of students, calling on them to be brave and not be afraid. And that resulted in the current criminal charges against them. They've been under house arrest. But despite that, they have been actually one of the leading independent media covering the news about the invasion of Ukraine, the current invasion. So it's been really brave of them. And as I said, I do believe that people like that, young people like that, are the future of Russia. There's still I think there's a lot of generational difference. Sort of older people that have memories both of the Soviet Union and then the 90s, where there was a lot of freedom, but at the same time, there was a lot of chaos and instability. So there's sort of this fear of the 90s. And I think a lot of younger people, I don't have that kind of traumatic memory, but they are very much sort of interconnected with the West and exposed to ideas about internet freedom, and they have enjoyed a free internet for some time. And so there is a lot more sort of thinking and protest activities, I think, and independent thinking that's coming from younger people.
Nathalie Maréchal is also here with us, who's a senior policy manager at Ranking Digital Rights. Nathalie, you were telling us about some of the history under the former Soviet Union when the fall happened. There was this loosening and more access to news and information. But with the rise of Putin, there has been the crackdown again. And so when we think about his influence and when this started, it was long before the war in Ukraine. Can you tell us about that and his reaction to the internet and how it can breed more of this, feelings against him and what he is trying to do as leader?
For sure. So one thing that happened very soon after Vladimir Putin first came into power at the end of 1999 is that he started to systematically bring free and independent media back under the control of his regime. And so he, of course, framed it as being about liberating these media organizations from the control of the oligarchs, from the private sector who had acquired all kinds of formerly state-owned entities. And so gradually bringing all of these organizations under the direct state authority, and over time also less directly controlling them by putting people who owed him favors and that he had influence over in charge of the media. And then in 2011 is when he really started to crack down on the internet and on social media platforms in particular. This was, if you remember, this was the time when the Arab Spring was breaking out. All kinds of countries around the world were having so-called color revolutions, and there was a lot of somewhat overstated excitement in the press around the world about how all these social media revolutions, these Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions and so on, were pushing back against dictators. That year in Russia, there were widespread protests against the Vladimir Putin and the fact that the legislative elections that year were widely seen, including by international election observers, as having been rigged in favor of Putin's party. And he still managed to win the elections because rigging elections works, right? Or it can work at any rate. And he became convinced that the internet as a whole and social media in particular was a U.S. ploy to undermine him and his regime, and started to crack down really seriously on both international internet companies and also domestic ones in Russia. And it's interesting how everything kind of comes back around, because we were talking about Telegram earlier on this show, and the founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, had before that founded Vkontakte or VK, which is one of the major social media platforms in Russia, and he was forced out of his own company because, again, in 2011, 2012, he had refused to turn over information about people who were planning protests on the platform, or censoring groups where people were doing political organizing. And so he wound up, along with his brother and another colleague, leaving Russia and founding Telegram, which of course now is one of the places where Russian civil society is able to organize.
You're hearing Nathalie Maréchal here on Where We Live as we talk about Russian censorship. She's Senior Policy Manager at Ranking Digital Rights. That's an organization working to evaluate internet, mobile, and telecommunications based on human rights standards. Also with us on Zoom, Natalia Krapiva, Tech Legal Counsel for Access Now, an organization that defends digital rights of internet users around the world. So Natalia, tell us more about this circumvention. We have referenced VPNs earlier. We know that many Russians are using Telegram, and when we think about the fact that media outlets like Reuters reporting that the week of February 28th, you saw Russian users downloading VPN apps, I think 2.7 million times. That's a threefold increase. Also using these encrypted messaging apps like Telegram that can access blocked websites now that the Kremlin has shut down Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, I believe. But when we think about, the digital rights of these users and these workarounds, is it still a small percentage of the Russian people?
It's hard to say how many people exactly are using these tools, but we have seen, as you mentioned, there's been reporting on increase in the use of some of these tools, such as Proton, VPN, Lantern, other VPN services, and Tor, by thousands of percent. So something that they haven't seen before. Some of them were relatively sort of obscure tools, and now again, individuals in Russia are really increasingly using them. It's hard to tell how many, and it seems to be mostly, again, those who are younger and sort of who have a little bit more sort of tech skills and understanding of how technology works. It's less true for older people, people who are sort of more away from big cities. We have seen some polling done, I think, by Radio Free Europe that said that people who are getting people who are reading news are it's a very small percentage that actually is using VPNs to read the news. But again, overall, this is increasing. And I think as censorship is going to increase, there will be also increase in this use of these types of circumvention tools. And I say that sort of as a cat and mouse game, especially with the civil society, and human rights organizations, independent media. They have been using increasingly under this pressure of censorship and surveillance. And so I want to remain confident that they will continue evading censorship and using these tools. But at the same time, of course, in terms of how accessible these tools are, is another question, I think, for the regular people, for the reasons that I mentioned. And another reason is that, of course, due to increasing sanctions, it's becoming difficult. For example, payment methods don't work because of, sanctions on banks and payment systems. And so this is something that users report, that it's becoming also difficult to download and pay for these services. But we are seeing also positive development where I think Lantern and others are, for example, now providing these tools for free. And so this is something that we want to see more and more happening, where companies and hopefully also there's more funding for this kind of tools, and the companies that provide them for free or make them more accessible and user friendly also for those maybe users in Russia who are not so technologically savvy.
And when you mention not technologically savvy, those who may not even know how a VPN works, we'll get into that right after a short break. You're hearing Natalia Krapiva here from Access Now and Nathalie Maréchal from Ranking Digital Rights as we talk about Russian censorship. More after a short break. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. We're talking about censorship in Russia and how crackdowns on free press and social media impacts the amount of information Russians receive, especially with this continued war in Ukraine. My guest, Natalia Krapiva, tech legal counsel for Access Now, an organization that defends the digital rights of internet users around the world, and Nathalie Maréchal, a senior policy manager at Ranking Digital Rights, an organization that evaluates internet, mobile, and telecommunications based on human rights standards. Nathalie, we heard Natalia mention VPN a few times. Again, this is a virtual private network. So if someone were in Russia and they tried to access Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and these again are blocked by Moscow with a VPN, just briefly describe for us again how this works so they're able to access that information.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to think of a VPN is to think of it as a magic portal that transports you from where you physically are in the world. So in this case, in Moscow, perhaps, and transports you magically to somewhere else, like Berlin. And so you're able to access the internet as if you were in that new location.
Mm. And Natalia, when we think about the role of Putin in this censorship, in some senses, the unintended consequence in boosting digital literacy in Russia, especially among the younger generation, can you talk about that?
Yes, sure. I think you can say that that it's definitely, as I mentioned, based on statistics that we see from this. That provide these tools, that there's the usage has increased by a lot. And so it seems to be even some people in Russia that and some of the friends that I know, for example, before that they never used or other tools, all of a sudden are switching to them to stay on Instagram and other platforms because some are bloggers or vloggers. Or they want to stay in touch with their friends. It's not even just political people who want to get the news. It's just regular users who have been relying on these platforms, again, to communicate with friends and family. Some of them, like vloggers, they for example, depend, they have some income that they're getting from their presence online. And so we've seen those people that before, I think, didn't care as much about and they're now using this tool. So this is something that probably is like an unintended consequence of this. And I think, honestly, this is why probably we haven't seen a full blocking of platforms before. There was sort of selective throttling. We saw Twitter being throttled in 2021, partially. We saw other sort of selected or temporary blockings. But in terms of like full-scale blockings, this is something the government hasn't been doing. I think understanding that it might have those consequences, and that even those people who are sort of away from politics, that might get them to use circumvention tools, but also become more sort of active because again, like what is happening might affect them directly. And so this is something that we might see now. It's hard to tell. I think you were discussing earlier that it might be still early to know what's going to happen in terms of more people protesting or feeling the effect of sanctions and these blockings. But I think we will definitely see in the next few months as to whether actually the protest activity and the people who will be more affected by what's happening, what Russia is doing. We might see more of them sort of expressing their opinions about that.
Natalie, before we run out of time, I did want to ask, how tech giants are navigating this. Looking at a headline, about 10 days ago, a Moscow court found Meta guilty of extremist activity based on what was being shared on Facebook and Instagram. Of course, there's Google, and we know there's international media that still have staff in Russia. And so how they navigate this censorship while still trying to get information out there.
Gosh, we could easily spend a couple hours talking about this. In short, I'd say it's really, really complicated, and companies are constrained by first their ability or their need and their obligation to protect their staff on the ground and not put them in additional danger. Trying to have coherent policies that they can stand by in the future and in other parts of the world. They're not doing a great job of that. And also actually having policies that they can enforce. And that's something that they're really struggling with as well. So it's really complicated, and it's going to continue to be really complicated for a long time, but we're watching closely.
And Natalia, did you want to add to that?
No, I would just add to that actually the localization laws or landing laws are also important aspect that companies began complying just before this recent, before the invasion, before this recent sort of extremism and other actions by the government. And so that will be also another complex part of it is that companies now have presence, offices and staff on the ground, and which we have seen in September of last year, where Apple and Google were pressured through their staff in Russia to remove Alexei Navalny's team's smart voting project app. And so this is something that I'm afraid we will see more of in terms of government using intimidation of the staff on the ground of these tech giants.
And Natalia, before we run out of time, we've got about a minute, but I should ask you, when we think about how Russia is actively working, of course, to disrupt the information being shared in Ukraine, what can you tell us?
Sure. We were hearing from partners on the ground that as Russia, first of all, in general, there seems to be attack on infrastructure, internet, mobile services, electricity. Obviously, we all heard of Mariupol, where people are cut off from the outside world, but also in the territories that Russia occupies, of course, Crimea and East Ukraine, but also the new territories they take. What we're hearing from partners is that they take over, they replace the infrastructure, and then start streaming Russian government propaganda immediately, and using it as a part of their military strategy, that they have this digital part as well that they are using against the Ukrainian population.
You've been hearing Natalia Krapiva here on Where We Live, Tech Legal Counsel with Access Now. That's an organization that defends the digital rights of internet users around the world. Natalia, thank you for your perspective today.
Thank you for having me.
Also here with us, Nathalie Maréchal, Senior Policy Manager at Ranking Digital Rights, an organization that evaluates internet, mobile, and telecommunications based on human rights standards. Nathalie, thanks for your context as well.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. You can download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. We hope you have a great weekend. We're back on Monday.